Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I think this issue of digital data services, tax, and just what digital data is really important. And so therefore, I wanted to reach out to Dr. Kean Birch. He is the Ontario Research Chair in Science Policy, and he's a professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at York University. He's the founding director of the Institute for Technoscience and Society at York University. And he's very interested in digital data, especially how data is transformed into economic assets, a process he conceptualizes as assetization. Interesting word. Professor, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So we've just finished a conversation about how Canadian innovators feel about digital services and digital services taxes, and we'll come back to that, I think, in a couple of minutes with you. But maybe let's take a big step back and tell me, what do you mean by digital data?
Sure. So obviously, there's data has been around for a long time, but digital data, I think, is something that's new and different, and generally it reflects what I call a kind of massification of information gathering. So the huge expansion that's happened as a consequence of the digital technologies that we've developed and deployed and diffused across our economies. And so generally speaking, digital data includes all sorts of data that gets generated from these digital technologies. So it's the user-generated data from social media, social networks, and so on, all the kind of commenting, liking, following, all that sort of stuff. There's also just social data, demographic data about, ourselves that is being collected all the time. Locational data, smartphones have really changed that in the sense that, there's an enormous amount of data about our locations, where we are, where we go, that sort of thing. Then there's other kinds of data like sensitive data, health data and that sort of thing that's been collected for a while, but it's increasingly digitalized. Industrial data that's collected by, companies, public data collected by governments. There's even something called synthetic data, which is data that's been made up to kind of be used for training, AI models and such like. So kind of trying to reflect, real world data, but maybe you can't get access to it, or you want to de-identify it, or you want anonymous data. So you create data to train these algorithms. So yeah, there's a huge expansion in the collection of this kind of data. Some of the new kinds of dimensions to it there's new kinds of objectives to this data, why we collect it, for example. So online advertising has changed some of the objectives for collecting this kind of digital data. There's new kinds of ways of collecting data. Again, we can think of online advertising with, the interest in our online attention, where, what we're looking at, that sort of thing. And then new kinds of logics of use. Again, if we stay with online advertising, the kind of inferential predictions that people try to use the data for to, sell.
So you think that all this data is important, and it's important to keep? I think I've got probably as much data on a cloud as companies would have had, a decade ago. It's unbelievable how much garbage data that every single one of us seems to collect and store, with tens of thousands of pictures on our phones and things like this. Is it all really important data?
Well, I think what's interesting about data is the fact that as we collect more of it and as we combine it, we combine different data sets, you can start doing new things. So if you combine, a data set on, locational data, for example, and demographic data, say, you can start working out who goes where, when, and what kind of behaviors different different portions of the population undertake. And that you can't do without combining all that data and at scale. So as you expand the amount of data and the number of data sets that you have available, and you combine them, you can do all sorts of new things. There's also a lot of what we could call emergent properties of data, in the sense as you expand the amount of data that you collect, again, you can start thinking about doing new things, things that would not occur to you before, and that are a consequence of the kind of massification I mentioned before of data production. So we could think of inferential, I mentioned inferential predictions. We can do that as a consequence of this huge collection of data, massification of data collection or data production, because we can start making inferential predictions not only about um, the people the data refers to, but also about people who are not included in the data. Just by using the profiles of the people in the data, you can make inferences about other people who have similar profiles. So there's all sorts of different things that can be done with the data at this scale that we couldn't predict, say 20 years ago at the start of the kind of data, I guess data surveillance era, if you like.
How is it I don't know, measured or valued? Like, is it just bits of data? Or like, how do you value or measure data?
Well,
When
that's
I
where
think about, the Encyclopedia Britannica, it was sort of the information that was most known or most important to know was in 26 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, with all this extra data, is it more valuable than the Encyclopedia Britannica? Is there a way of putting some sort of measure on that?
So this is some of the research that I'm trying to do now is look at this valuation issue. So people have been writing about it for some time. Um, but one of the problems is there's no agreement on how you go about valuing data. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about it. You could think about what's the value of, say, um, very, very, very narrow data points, your name, my name, our date of birth, these sorts of things. What's the value of those kinds of bits of information? And if you break it down to those individual data points, actually the value of those individual data points is very low. A minute percentage of a cent, basically. So what you have to kind of think about is data in the aggregate, and that's where it really starts becoming valuable because it's the collection this collection together, combination of data, multiple data sets that are brought together, the mass of data that becomes really valuable because that's where you can start doing these interesting things that I mentioned. So that's where you have to start thinking about how do we value that kind of data. And I think that there's a growing consensus both in the kind of business world, policy world, maybe even academic world, that the best way to think about data and to think about its value is to think about data as this kind of economic asset. Hence, what you mentioned at the beginning, why I'm interested in this process of assetization, the transformation of things into assets. So if we think about data as an asset, we can think about these kinds of large data sets or multiple data sets or this large aggregation of data as an asset that a company can use over multiple years, generates future benefits to it, and therefore it has this value that these future value that you can calculate what's called the net present value now, right, from this future benefits that they can generate from it. So that's one way of doing it. And I think that's probably the way that will be settled on in the coming years. But at present, there's no requirement to record data on a balance sheet. So companies don't have to record data on a balance sheet. So you have these very kind of huge valuations of companies, market capitalization of companies or private valuations of companies, in which it's unclear, there's no direct correlation to to these data because there's no recording of it on the balance sheets. And so you have companies, this kind of so-called big tech companies, Microsoft, Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, who have huge valuations, but their asset base is actually relatively small in a sense, and so their valuation is based upon the expectations of the future benefits that data will generate for them, but that are not currently recorded on their balance sheets.
There was this one analysis that I saw that said that these social media companies, Facebook, Meta, Google, et cetera, were driven by their networks, not their data. So it was how many people that they had actually on. Is that just sort of a proxy for data, or is that different that you had all these connections?
Yeah, so what's interesting if you study them, these big tech companies, they often don't talk about personal data. So they do, as you mentioned, they'll talk about users. and they'll talk about user engagement, and they'll talk about user monetization. And so I see these as being proxies for, the data that they're collecting. So these users are essentially the data about the users, right? It's not just simply the users; they need the data about the users as well in order to be, have value. If you're a company like Amazon, you want to know what kind of users will buy X products, or what kind of users will pay X amount for whatever product that they're interested in. If you're a company like Alphabet or Meta, you're interested in, being able to um, sell profiles, targeting people through advertising, sell that to advertisers so that you can segment people and so on. There are other kinds of things that companies might be interested in as well. How do you use this data to optimize, say, logistics, or retail operations, or what have you, or model different kinds of probabilities, the inferences that I mentioned already, or build new products and so on. What kind of information can you gather from people, from users, about their uses of products, and what kind of products they might like, and such things that you can get from all this data from users.
I had this interesting presentation about digital twins of buildings that
Huh.
described all the blueprints that were done for buildings over, I don't know, a millennium. Were all 2D, and were not digitized, and were not stored, and so therefore, had to be copied and or from the memory of a drafter or an architect, and that you could actually put in data actual 3D digital twins of buildings, and then cut and paste them as you built new buildings, and that you could create this 3D image that you could walk into to see what the building would look like, and that this
Mhm.
would not only be good for the ultimate user, but incredibly good for the contractor. I was going like, this sounds like space age stuff.
Yeah, well, if you combine this kind of data with new kinds of technologies, building software. I can't remember what these software programs are called. Creative. I can't remember. So if you combine this kind of data with these kinds of software, these kinds of other kinds of digital tools, then yeah, 3D print a building, right? That you get at smaller scale to have a look at it and so on. You can do all sorts of things with this kind of data that would be very helpful and productive and useful. And there's all sorts of things you could do with, say, transit data, traffic data, weather data, all sorts of stuff that would be very helpful for managing,
But
social
we've
issues.
got Google Maps and Waze and a whole bunch of other things, and we still get stuck in traffic, and we still have traffic jams, we still have accidents. Like, what gives? Like, is all this data helpful? So we've got tons more data.
Mhm.
You call it massification or assetization of data. You're saying that it's not on the balance sheet, but companies realize how critically important it is, and they keep on storing it. And I guess the question then that we've got to ask ourselves is twofold. Number one, is this good or bad for society, and how should we govern it, and what are the risks of it, and then second of all, this issue that you wrote the editorial or the column in the Toronto Star on is this digital services tax of any value, and should Prime Minister Carney have dropped it in response to threats from the U.S. president. So let's take a break for some messages and come back with our expert in just 2 minutes to talk about these issues. Stay with us, everyone. Back in two. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Professor Kean Birch with us today. He's from York University. He is the Ontario Research Chair in Science Policy and Professor in the Science and Technology Studies Graduate Program and Department of Science, Technology, and Society at York University. You won the 2025 President's Research Excellence Award. How the heck does one win the President's Research Excellence Award?
Well, that's the York University president, just to be clear. Every year there are award ceremonies at universities for research, for teaching, sometimes for service. So this year I was nominated by my department. The nomination process, I guess, it's probably different in different universities, but it entails reaching out to external reviewers who comment on my career career, I guess. And yeah, and then there's a decision at the university by an awards committee. So that's generally.
You're also the number three most cited researcher in the Faculty of Science at York University. Is that good data to figure out that you're the most the third most cited researcher?
For me, it's interesting. I find that because I'm a social scientist, I'm in a science faculty, and it's interesting to find out that data. So there's a Stanford University and Elsevier, the publishing multinational. They every year they use the data that Elsevier collects about citations and such like to calculate and to work out who the most cited people are in the academic world. And then they produce a list of the top 2% most cited people every year. Yeah, they publish it as an Excel spreadsheet. It's, there's tens, well, there's probably, I don't know how many thousands of researchers there are, but there are, quite a few thousand researchers on that list. But I worked out where I sat within the university, my university, and yeah, just as a kind of exercise.
Well, congratulations on winning the President's Award and also being
Thanks.
on the third most cited individual. I got to ask you, because you say that you're an interdisciplinary social scientist who is interested in the changing political economy of science, technology, and innovation, the political economy. I listened to this fascinating interview with Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather or grandfather or whatever, father of artificial intelligence. And he was really worried about data, personal data, particularly from the U.S. government that Doge was getting that Elon Musk had. And this was a couple months ago, where he was saying this could be used by someone who would want to set up a new political party or something like this, because what we would know is all the information about everybody and what they do and where they work and how they vote and what influences them, such that we could create a situation where we could influence people better than ever before, manipulate people better than ever before to change how they think about issues in the world and how they're going to vote. Are you worried about data being used like that?
Yeah, there's always risks with data and the way the data gets used. So something I think the US is in a particularly I don't know what you call it, a momentous moment, although that might be a tautology, right now, in the sense that we've not seen this sort of thing happen in a country like the US, where there's been what I would think of as a kind of breakdown in the usual rule of law and the usual kind of institutional separation of or separation of social institutions. So you have an individual like Elon Musk, who is characterized as a member of the kind of growing tech oligarchy in the US that President Biden.
Tech bros. Are there really tech bros?
Well, tech bros, tech oligarchs. This is what President Biden warned about in his final address as president in January this year. So, people with an enormous amount of wealth who are have an enormous influence on innovation, enormous amount of influence on technology, enormous amount of influence now with the kind of role he's had in the Trump administration, enormous influence on social policy, welfare policy, all these sorts of things, and access enormous, you get this access to enormous amount of public data that the government collects. So as you pointed out, there's risks with political risks here. We know that Elon Musk is now wanting to set up a new political party. I think he's calling it the American Party or something like that. So he has, as you pointed out, he has all this data that he could use in ways. And the US does not have, right now, the US does not have the, sort of legal means to stop him to do this, because as I said, the rule of law is, seeming to break down. So it doesn't have the same arrangements, the same kind of data governance arrangements that other jurisdictions have, like the European Union, for example, has a suite of regulations to cover the use of data. It has something called the General Data Protection Regulation, which came into force in 2018, and that's there to regulate how data is used, how data is collected, and who has rights over, the data subjects, their rights over this data that gets collected about them. The EU also introduced, I think in 2022, um, a few more regulations. I think Digital Markets Act, the Data Governance Act, I think, and the maybe Digital Services Act. So a range of other kinds of regulations that are supposed to constrain the power of big tech, tech oligarchs and so on, when it comes to both the economic and the political use of data. And places like the US, they don't have a national federal set of regulations. Canada has a very weak set currently, and it's been trying to implement or introduce a new digital privacy data protection legislation for a long time. I think Canada's federal government first started trying to do this back in 2019. So it's 6 years of trying to implement something to update the PIPEDA 2000, PIPEDA. I can never remember it's personal information and something act, but it's the Privacy Act, basically, Canada's Privacy Act, but it hasn't been updated since the year 2000, and it's been kind of stalled. And then you get to things like the Digital Services Tax, which was introduced to to tax these large companies, multinational companies that operate in Canada, but are able to use international tax transfer pricing, etc., to avoid as much taxation as possible. And these sorts of things are being considered in other jurisdictions as well. And it was a very minimal tax, I think, in Canada. I think it was a 3% on revenues for e-commerce, social,
And only for revenues above a very high dollar figure.
Right.
So this is the topic right now, because you wrote this really interesting piece called "Killing the Digital Services Tax is a Step Backwards" last week. And what you wrote in LinkedIn is that your basic argument is that big tech firms like Google extract billions of dollars worth of data assets from Canadians each year for free. If these billions are added to trade stats, then Canada has a huge trade deficit with the USA. We're handing over our incredibly valuable data resources to US companies for nothing.
Yeah.
So why do you think this digital services tax should have been kept? Why is it a step backwards for Prime Minister Carney to have given it up? And
Well, I think it's
so quickly.
I think it's a step backwards politically because it's a ceding to Donald Trump's demands, and I think that's a problem if Canada's sovereign decisions are cancelled so easily when it comes to negotiations with the US. When it comes to data itself, what I was trying to argue in that article, or what I was arguing, was that if we think about data as an asset, going back to this notion of assetization, then we have to understand the value of all our data, Canadian data, if you like, to these US-based, US headquartered companies like Alphabet or Meta or Microsoft or wherever. And the value of this data is enormous. And I mentioned before that if you disaggregate it into individual data points, then the value is quite small. But actually, if you aggregate it up, then it becomes incredibly valuable. So I had actually previously I'd done some research with some collaborators, a couple of graduate students, trying to work out the value of data to Alphabet, Google. What is the value of our personal data to Alphabet? And we basically tried to work out using their financial reports, earnings calls, and such, like what it is that they valued, and then extrapolate from that to try and calculate a kind of individual, the value of an individual's personal data. And Google Alphabet, Google and Alphabet have been very obsessed with something called traffic acquisition costs, which is the cost of attracting users, you and I, whoever to their suite of programs or products or services, etc. So they have Google Alphabet has 50 plus apps or products, whatever, that we use regularly, and they want to attract users to that that suite of products in order to collect data from us. And they pay a lot of money to do that. And each year, if you look at their financial reports, they're paying, tens of billions of dollars each year for something they call the traffic acquisition costs. And that includes the amount of money that they pay smartphone manufacturers to set something like Google Search as the default search engine on their smartphones. So there's the recent findings in a couple of Department of Justice lawsuits that the U.S. government brought against Google last year for antitrust or monopoly violations. One on search engines and one on the ad tech sector, and they found that they were identified the billions of dollars that Google or Alphabet and Google have paid Apple. So each year to set Google Search as the default on its Safari browser. So I think the last estimate was it's between something like 16 and 18 billion US dollars each year that Alphabet Google pays to Apple to do this. So that's an enormous amount of money. So if you look at the number of so what we did in this paper that I did with these collaborators is we looked at the number of active iPhone users, and we used that as a proxy to kind of calculate how much each of those users is worth when it's you divide by 16 to 18 billion dollars, or you divide 16 to 18 billion dollars by by the number of active users, and it comes out at whatever amount, and then you extrapolate from that to work out the value that Google gets from your data. So that only represents that traffic acquisition costs represents, according to Google or Alphabet, represents something like 22% of their revenues. So we extrapolate from the amount that they pay in traffic acquisition costs to work out, how valuable that personal data is to Alphabet. And we came up with I think our value it's in the region of 60 US dollars per person. And that means that, if you times that by the number of people in Canada, it's, $3 billion in Canada per person. Well, not per person, sorry. $3 billion in Canada is the amount of
And
how valuable
that's per year?
Yeah, but
that's value that.
That's the revenues. But then if you think of data as an asset, right, then that's a recurring value, a recurring amount that Google is getting. So you can add a multiplier to that to work out the value of those data assets to Google. So I interview a lot of people as part of my research, and I was talking to an investor, a startup innovator, who said, well, you could add a multiplier, a kind of 8-fold multiplier, 10-fold multiplier to that to work out the value of that data as an asset. And so I did, and that comes out at 27 billion Canadian dollars, 27 billion US dollars, I think. Yeah. So it's a huge amount of value of our data assets that is being transferred to one US headquartered big tech company each year. And so if you think about it in that way, then it's digital services.
Yeah. It dwarfs the trade deficit in manufactured goods.
Yes. Yeah.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back for some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Interesting, fascinating conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with a professor from York University who specializes in data, and he's won a bunch of awards. He's obviously an incredibly smart individual, and you've really given this issue a lot of thought. You've written a op-ed in the Toronto newspaper, the Toronto Star, about this, and you say it's the digital services tax, or giving up on it is a step backwards. So I got to ask you, sir, if Prime Minister Carney asked you to come up to Ottawa and sit down with him, and maybe one or two other people, like his new minister who's responsible for AI, and maybe someone that was responsible for trade negotiations, and said, "Okay, what do we do?" What would your advice be?
So I've actually written about this. So my policy proposal is to set up something I'm calling the data wealth fund. So if we think about data as an asset, what do we do with other kinds of assets that countries have? We can think about natural resources, for example. Countries set up oil wealth funds, and so if we set up a data wealth fund, we can collect all our data together and charge for access, or generate revenues for the country, but by charging for access, licensing out access to data, managing that data in a way that we want it to be managed, and not letting the value of it seep out or get extracted from the country every year. So that would be my basic policy recommendation. It's this idea of a data wealth fund. I wrote about it in the Globe and Mail, I think last year or a couple of years ago, and I think that that's one way that we take back some of the kind of, I guess, sovereignty that we want or might want when it comes to our data.
I'm hearing about this issue more and more. I interviewed a military equipment expert who said that we haven't thought about how much data McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, etc., get from military equipment that we buy, Canada buys, but all the data goes back to the manufacturer in the United States, and they have complete control over our repairs and maintenance. In fact, if we were ever in a war, they could turn off the machines.
Yep.
How do we ever get, you use the word sovereignty. How do we ever get back our sovereignty when you've got a president like Donald Trump that seems so, he's only thinking about manufactured goods. He's not considering trade deficit in services, let alone trade deficit in data or a data wealth fund. Is this not something that really you've got to get the whole world, or at least the balance of the G7 or the European Union on board with before you can ever have a reasonable argument / discussion with the United States?
Well, I think the EU is already ahead of the game. I think they've, as mentioned already, they've already been implementing policies and regulations that are, they enforce, and they don't back down on enforcing them. So I think that's one route to take. The other route is, there's another route that's been taken by China, who have a set of data localization rules and regulations, which is about keeping the data within the country and within, nationally controlled data centers or what have you. So these are different options, and some are probably more attractive than others. And I think that the idea I mentioned of a data wealth fund is one way to go, and this is possible without, well, I don't know, maybe nothing is possible without Trump interfering right now. But there are options that can be taken, and decisions that need to be made, that will enable enable greater sovereignty for a country like Canada. And some of these options include the need for nationally based digital infrastructures, data centers, computing, cloud computing infrastructures, and so on, that are controlled within Canada and the Canadian borders. And
Well,
it sounds very good.
This sounds like it's also very applicable to each one of us individually, that we've got all this data that we just give away freely. Maybe we should be a little bit more cognizant of the value of the data that we have, and our own sovereignty.
Yeah, I think the problem we've had is that we've had 15 years or more of of companies changing their terms and conditions to whatever they want over the time, and promising us one thing and then changing it, a couple of years later. And it's very difficult actually to follow, what what we've handed over to companies when we look at the terms and conditions agreements that we're signing, the end user license agreements, or privacy agreements, all these sorts of things that are dozens of pages long, take you half an hour to read, hidden whatever, hidden kind of hidden articles in it, or not even hidden, but things that are not highlighted. But also that we weren't necessarily as aware of at the start of us getting used to signing these things back in, as I say, 15 years ago, that now are really important. So we also, there's no option to not sign over our data and still get access to the service. And these services have become part of our daily lives. So unless there is an option for not signing over handing over our data, we are dependent upon them. Pretty much everything nowadays is, as you pointed out, not just military, but if we think of our cars, that's collecting data all the time. Most of the machines in our houses are collecting data often, and most of them are most companies are trying to find ways to exploit that data and to generate revenues in new and interesting ways. We can think of printers that are designed to sort of turn into bricks as soon as we use generic ink, or that will update the software and brick the printer if we're not using them a certain way. Or tractors that are you have to take them back to the seller if you want to fix them, because the electronics and software are covered by digital rights management licenses. So you can't, as a farmer, you can't fix them yourselves. All these sorts of things that are just, proliferating through our societies that are, have done so, proliferated without much attention. And when the attention has turned to them, there's the companies that have benefited from this, have a lot of money and can fight back against regulation and such like.
Professor Kean Birch, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Interesting conversation. I think that bottom line, what you're saying is data is critically important. It's something we don't think about from a value standpoint, from an asset value standpoint, from a sovereignty standpoint, and it's something we should be thinking about a lot more. And maybe Prime Minister Carney and his cabinet have got to be giving this some thought in these upcoming negotiations with Donald Trump. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, and all my data is on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.